Welcome to this week's news program. I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. This program is a weekly news program. To help me this week is one of our regular reporters, Mr. Kevin Berglund. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now tonight we are going to follow up on a report that we started last week. Now specifically we were addressing the issue in Maplewood, the debate in Maplewood, if you want to call it that, of whether or not the city should own the recycling carts that the recycler picks up the recycling from each week. Now, is that a big issue to be debating? Well, that certainly is debatable. But the council spent a lot of time talking about this topic, and we're scratching our heads wondering why it is. Now, Mr. Berglund, one of the issues that certainly faces the city if they're going to be buying the carts for the recycling is the issue of financing and the money to buy the carts, correct?
Buying the carts, of course, does not come for, if the city does not come for free. Buying the carts, of course, is another venture, another enterprise the city wants to get into, the ownership of carts and what to do with the carts and making sure the carts are maintained. And of course, the carts got to be cleaned because there's all kinds of issues with what happens to carts over the years, and they have to all be managed. So it's a whole nother part of a department. So not only do you need to buy the carts, but you need to some way oversee the carts that you bought.
That's right. And we don't want to forget that Maplewood has just started to get out of the financial pickle that they put themselves into over the last few years. Now, Mr. Berglund, what I did for our viewers today is I went back into our archives because this is actually very important to understand and remember the financial pickles of Maplewood when they now today are talking about how they're going to buy these carts for recycling. So let's take a look at our first clip, and this is with regard to the budget and the problems Maplewood was having, and this is from a meeting back in June of 2019.
I first came here, I think we met with you all individually, and we talked about why the debt was as high as it was and what we could maybe do about it. And it seemed pretty daunting at the time. Michael Thompson was here as the Public Works Director at the time. He was very helpful in telling me about the history of the projects and just going through them and understanding what happened. But he didn't stay too long. And then Steve took over, and it took a little while for him to really get on board with all the things that he had. It took a while to get his position replaced. But we got together as soon as we could and started working on it.
One thing I want to point out there, Mr. Berglund, at the beginning of that clip, and while we're discussing this, perhaps we can bring that slide back up just to show our viewers all of the debt that we're looking at, is she indicated, the finance director indicated that they sat down with each city council member individually to go over these financial issues. Now, I believe that they did that with each of them individually so that they didn't have to do it as a meeting agenda item to the entire council, of which then the public would be knowledgeable of these debt issues.
And of course, these are all Maplewood's official secrets. We don't want to be transparent. We don't want to have community engagement. We don't want to inform taxpayers, residents, voters of what the big hole is in Maplewood budget. Maple it maybe shouldn't be Maplewood, but Maple Hole, because it's just a vortex which keeps sucking money down. And of course, the way around any kind of transparency, the way around any kind of open meeting law is for the city manager and her sidekick, the finance director, who are the big engineers of this big scheme to keep the curtains closed, is to meet with each one of the council members individually. You don't know when they're doing it, how long it occurs, there's no minutes, there's no audio recordings or video recordings, and you don't know what they said. Maplewood is not a company where the scoundrels can meet in the back rooms and engineer their PR and deceive the public and hold their official secrets until somebody sues them. Maplewood is a city, a public entity. It's owned by the public. But those overlords there, neither of them living in the city of Maplewood, believe they can run it as their own little club.
Right. Now let's bring up that clip real quick to look at that screenshot again. 80 million outstanding debt. 8 million overall deficit. A deficit. That's a big black hole, by the way. In improvement project funds. That's your road improvement funds. Let's pull it up again. 2.4 million deficit in municipal state aid account. That means another black hole.
And instead of a little dot, those should actually be plus signs there. Plus.
Yes.
It's an equation, isn't it? You just add them all up.
That's right.
And at the bottom there should be equal.
Equal.
And that's what they forgot to do, is put a bottom bar on there, how it is in addition, and then you add them all up, and then you get your grand total.
That's right. So let's pull it up. So those of you at home, get out your pen, get out your paper, and start adding them up. Then there's 8 million pending state payments, because you see the state of Minnesota, while they had money that they were supposed to pay Maplewood under certain programs, they refused to do so because Maplewood was delinquent on their payments to the state for other programs. You see how that works? Let's take a look again. And then there is an $8 million municipal state aid debt. Then there's the local government aid for debt service. Oh, and of course, then they tack on crumbling streets. But of course, what contributes to crumbling streets? The fact that Maplewood has been robbing, and I put that in quotation marks, robbing their sanitary and utility funds of $2 million so that they can do land speculation to buy land in the Gladstone area rather than use that money as it was intended for road improvement projects. There you go. So that's part of the financial condition. So let's continue with more of this clip from June 2019.
We were looking at about $80 million. It was starting to come down, but it was about $80 million in outstanding debt. We had an $8 million deficit in our public improvement project funds on the record, on the books. There was an $8 million deficit. Granted, most of that, probably $6 million of it, was English 36, but it was still a deficit right on our books. We also had a deficit in our state aid, municipal state aid account of $2.4 million. So therefore, we weren't receiving any additional state aid, and they were withholding about $8 million in pending state payments from us because we were too far in arrears. We also had about $8 million in municipal state aid debt, so that was debt that we issued for municipal state aid projects. We will still have some of that debt going forward, and when we get to the next slide, we'll show you where we're at today. We were getting local government aid, but we were primarily using it to pay debt service payments, not to buy down debt, but to pay the actual annual debt service payments. And our streets were not in very good.
So there she outlined exactly what we detailed.
And of course, instead of having dots or what we were talking about before, plus signs, actually they should all be negative signs, because what it's showing is the big hole, the negative. We're going negative, negative, negative up at the city of Maplewood.
Right.
And when you add all those negatives up, you get your grand total of how much, at the very least, you're in the hole. Of course, there's other factors which put it even dig a deeper hole in Maplewood, with the poor morale that exists with the employees in Maplewood, because the city manager, Melinda Coleman, has caused, and her sidekick, the finance director, and Mary Abrams, has caused a big problem, a huge problem with employee morale.
And keep in mind, when you say Mary Abrams, that's the appointed mayor,
Right.
Mary Abrams, who was not elected to that position.
And every employee up there knows that these scoundrels, along with the corrupt, in my mind, Ramsey County Election Department, every employee knows that they don't even pay attention to elections anymore, because they got this system maneuvered and rigged, and they just go ahead and deceive the public, and then put the people that Melinda Coleman, Vicki Reinhardt, the county commissioner, and the unfortunate, corrupt Ramsey County Election Department under Joe Mansky wanted to put in.
Right. Well, let's take a look at our next clip, which is, again, is from June 2019, about the finances of Maplewood.
It is right now, as of this moment, we have about $58 million in outstanding debt. Part of that is just due to the natural amortization schedule, and part of it is due to some of the incremental changes that we've made having a small effect. Every one of our deficit projects is paid up and closed off. Steve and I met and we went through, I think, probably 15 of them. And we looked at the reasons why they were in deficit. We followed up on funding sources, other agencies that hadn't paid what they were supposed to pay. We collected those payments with some help from my staff. We had some surpluses in some newer projects that we were able to use. But the bottom line is we only have a few active project funds, and those are the ones that we're actually constructing right now. All of the deficit funds have been closed, with the exception of English 36. That will be paid off in January of 2020. There's still a deficit of $748,000, which is a far cry from the $6 million. That will be paid up in January of 2020.
So it is only after they've taken some corrective actions that they have been open with the public to say what the financial problems were previously that they were covering up. And that, of course, is not the way to be operating your local municipal government. This should have been brought to light way before now. And I find it ironic that here we have, at the top they say that they have brought the debt down from 80 million to 58, and some of it is because it's been paid off, some of it is because they've been taking incremental changes in their structure. Well, what we've been reporting on these news programs is that they have actually been shifting how some of their debt is acquired, and by using different methods, not all of those methods are required to be included in that long-term debt number. So for instance, if they do abatement bonds, for instance, which is a form of debt, they don't have to include those in that long-term debt number. And Maplewood has been doing abatement bonds over the last few years, and we've done news programs on those.
And of course, that was the finance director of the city of Maplewood. In my mind, chalk up credibility problems. In that June slide that she was saying, there's $8 million deficit on the debt in the English 36 project. Now, of course, everybody knows where the English 36 is over there in Frost, and everybody who has driven there knows what a disaster those entrance ramps over that bridge is. incorrectly constructed, a public safety hazard. And you can see if you drive over the bridge, the people sitting on the ramps, they look extremely frustrated and uneasy. Just look at people as everybody's crawling over that bridge, and you'll see in their faces.
And it's actually called the Maplewood creep.
Right.
Because you need to actually creep beyond the white line that is on the pavement in order to be able to see the visibility of whether there's any cars coming the other lane of traffic. So it is a very unsafe. It wasn't engineered properly. I don't know who was responsible for that, but certainly Maplewood has engineers on staff that should have caught it if it was the state engineers that created this problem.
I think Maplewood overseeing that project was in charge of that project, so whatever specific individual it was, that is going to be hidden by the city of Maplewood. So you can only imagine who it is. Also, in the June slide, they said there was an $8 million problem. Now, when she referred to it just then in her most recent presentation, she called it a $6 million problem. So her figures are all ambiguous, just made up. And of course, there's no real reporting to the public. I assume, but can you assume? The city council gets in their private emails and their private conversations a more detailed response. All you get here is, look, we're chasing the rainbow and we're succeeding. Of course, first of all, are their numbers accurate? Second of all, they're shifting from these other funds that don't need to be reported. Additionally, they're taking profits or taking money from other street projects, as she says, where they have a surplus balance, and they're moving it to pay off their deficit and debts. Now, of course, when you over specially assess street projects, what are you doing? Are you giving a fair and true and accurate deal to the residents who have to pay these special assessments?
Well, let's continue then with our next clips from our archives, where they were talking about the purchasing of trash carts back at a workshop in May of 2019. And we want to bring this forward because some of this conversation from May 2019 is being relied upon now today when they are discussing whether or not they should or should not buy these recycling carts for the recycling pickup. So let's take a look at our first clip about purchasing carts.
We own the carts for trash hauling, and I wanted to point this out because we are looking at the feasibility of purchasing recycling carts. So here's a scenario currently for our trash carts. In 2012, when we first organized trash hauling, we ordered 10,330 trash carts at a price of $404,876 approximately. Those carts have a 10-year warranty, and we finance those through a 7-year utility bond. To pay for that bond, the city charges 75 cents per household per month and that's added onto the trash bill to cover the cost of the carts. And the final payment for that utility bond is ending now this year. This will be the 7th year, so our carts will be fully paid off. And moving forward, we'll work with our finance department to come up with a cash flow plan for replacement carts, because we are finding that there's about 1 to 5% of our carts that need to be replaced each year. And then financial management plan to determine the future cart fee. Is that 75 cent per household still an accurate number? Do we want to increase that, decrease that, depending on what our goals are?
From that slide, we found out a couple of things. One, Maplewood purchased a little over 10,000 carts, and the number of carts cost the city of Maplewood about $405,000. Now, they used an equipment bond to finance that. Equipment bonds aren't considered part of long-term debt. That's another area of debt that wasn't on those previous slides that we showed. So we have now found another debt that they had. It's going to be paid off this year. Carts have a 10-year warranty, and the financial obligation to pay off the bonds is 7 years. And you heard how they're going to come up with a financial plan for replacement. Well, that just means that they're going to jack up the bill for garbage hauling so that they can replace carts.
But if you want to do the equation,
Yes.
okay, they have a 10-year warranty. Why do they, if they have a cart that they need to return, isn't it warranted? So they have 3 more years where the carts are safe, if this is all accurate information. If they now have completed their payment of those carts after 7 years, and they've been charging 75 cents in this special fund to pay for them on your monthly bill, why would they charge more than 75 cents for the carts that are already paid for? Why wouldn't it go to the logical conclusion, 0? So if they're going to continue to charge 75 cents and possibly more, they're creating another fund which they can take and pay for their schemes out of because the carts are all paid for. And of course, one thing that is not reported from the professionals up in Maplewood is how much money did they raise by their 75 cents per month? Did they raise precisely $405,000, or did they raise $700,000? And they've schemed and they've scammed and they've transferred money that people paid out of this fund. And so you can only imagine, why do they want to now do recycling carts? Because they look at it as another fund in which they can take money out of to pay for the vortex that is up at the city of Maplewood. Anything they can do to create some special fund, and they got a ton of them, which they can take the slush out of it, a cut out of it, and dump it in their pockets.
Well, let's take a look at the next slide from May 2019, where they move on to this idea of purchasing more carts to provide carts for the recycling. Let's take a look.
We have a great opportunity to apply for a grant with Ramsey County. They offer a public entities grant where they'll cover the cost of 1/2 of the carts. So when we're looking at recycling right now with our residential curbside, there's about 12,000 carts at an estimated $55 per cart. That's $660,000, of which Ramsey County would cover half that cost. So we did look at some feasibility of funding those. One option would be to fund that $330,000 with the city's recycling reserve fund. And then, of course, we still have the 4,206 multifamily units, but again, we don't have that many carts out there, and we are looking at the dumpster option. So we'd have to look at the opportunities there and the costs for city-owned dumpsters, if that is something that we wanted to look at.
The Recycling Reserve Fund. Now this is, again, going back to what you said, another secret slush fund. Now, we have reported on these programs that with the Maplewood recycling bill, Tennis, who is the recycling company, they charge the city of Maplewood the amount of recycling charged under the contract, which is the amount per pickup. Maplewood then takes that charge and they add on over 80 cents per bill to each of the households, and they collect additional money over and above what Tennis is charging for the service. So that's where that recycling slush fund comes from. Maplewood doesn't provide any extra services for that. They're not paying for carts from that. They've just been collecting that money for years and years and years.
And of course, they imply in those slides that they have at least $330,000 in that slush fund, because although the slide says it would be funded by the recycling fund, if you listen to what she said, one potential might be it's funded by that recycling fund, making it sound like in part. So no, with the integrity and credibility of Maplewood, I would assume that they've been raiding that fund secretly, and whatever that fund should have been, and I mean, if they're collecting $80,000, we know that 75 cents adds up to at least $405,000. So,
and keep in mind, we want to be clear that when we say that they're raiding these funds, we're using quotations around the word raiding, because of course there are legitimate ways that they can create a paper trail to borrow the money from one of these special funds for a different purpose other than the purpose the money was intended for. All they have to do is have an interdepartmental loan where they've documented the paper trail on their electronic books, and that they've gotten the buy-in of the council, who has passed a resolution who says it's okay. But in essence, they're raiding the money.
and of course, borrowing is in quotes too, because there is no obligation to pay back what they borrowed. And knowing Maplewood and its credibility, it would be a snowball in hell's chance that they would ever pay back those funds.
Or that they could just push it off to another day.
Like a day a long ways away. While at the same time they are increasing their fees. Because if Maplewood buys a recycling carts, not only will they have an 80-cent processing fee, which it'll probably go up probably to $1 or $1.20, but then they will have a cart fee. And we know for the last 7 years, the cart fee on the garbage can was 75 cents. They will probably have a recycling can utility fund fee, which they will add probably another $1.30 onto it.
Our viewers out there might say, well, why does the city even need to own the garbage carts or even own the recycling carts? I mean, what is the purpose of the city owning the carts if the city isn't providing the service? You're having some other outside contractor do the service, whether or not if it's Republic doing the garbage hauling or it's Tennis doing the recycling. You're having somebody outside doing that service. Why not have those businesses provide the carts? I mean, currently, Tennis does provide the carts for the recycling service. Well, let's listen to this next clip, which again is from May 2019, where Council Member Kathleen Juniman tells us the reason why the city has to own the carts. It must be a very important reason, I'm sure. Let's listen in.
Survivor of the original trash routine, I thought I would give a little bit of background on the ownership of carts. We decided that that was more than appropriate for a couple of reasons, but the first one is you never have to deal with the vendor exchange that they are still dealing with in St. Paul in their marvelous approach to organized trash. That was the major reason. And then the environmental committee at that time also said they didn't want 5 different colors, 4 different styles. When you look down the street, it's kind of nice to just see a trash cart and a recycling cart that are the same at every house. It just is a better environmentally pleasing effect.
So Kathleen Juniman says the reason that the city has to own the carts is because the Environmental Commission said they didn't want to see 4 or 5 different colors of carts up and down the road. Mr. Berglund, what happens when you go to organized trash collection? You're with one hauler, correct?
Correct.
Does that one hauler use 4 or 5 different colored cans for their garbage pickup, or do they have just one color which would have their name on it, which would be blue, that would say Republic on it?
Wow.
Okay, well,
But
let's,
her reasoning sounds so plausible, didn't it? I mean, she's just pleading with people. We don't want diversity in our city. We don't want any color change in our city. All we want is uniformity in our city. And yet, that's what you get when you get, by definition, when you go with organized recycling, as occurs in Maplewood.
recently I watched a movie. It was a remake of an old movie. It was called The Stepford Wives. You know what was the uniform thing in The Stepford Wives? Every house looked the same. Everybody walked the same. Everybody had the same car. Everybody had the same ornament in their yard. Wow, Maplewood could be the home of the Stepford Wives.
Well, yeah, that would be a real change of pace, because you could just paint all the homes, by ordinance, require that every home built has the same color shingles, has the same color housing, house exterior, has everybody drives the same color car. Everybody is required to plant the same kind of trees. Wouldn't that uniformity be environmentally pleasing for all the neighbors? I mean, wouldn't that really add real value to the community? In fact, why don't you just have require that all the homes are designed the same way? In fact, why couldn't they all be made prefably at the factory in the same way? And wouldn't that be a visionary community? And this would be our top priority for doing something, because that would be environmentally sound and environmentally pleasing, and it would do wonders for the climate change issue.
Yes. Well, you see, the point we're making is this a valid reason for the city, first of all, to be spending all this time and effort on whether or not they should own carts or not own carts, and second of all, to be spending money or asking the taxpayers ultimately to foot the bill for the city to own garbage carts and recycling carts?
And we know in the city of Maplewood, they all have had this charm ideals throughout the history of Maplewood. First, we were going to do a nature center, have a public nature center, which would have a building on and would be like it was a science museum. Of course, it really doesn't have the ability to run that, and it doesn't. The staffing is overwhelmingly costly, and nobody ever attends it, and it sits there basically empty. Now they want to dump that. Of course, they had 25 years ago, we were going to have a community center, because the community center was absolutely necessary. It was a great enterprise for the city to get into. Of course, every year, huge deficits, $500,000 deficits. Then we had to get rid of that. So now the new thing is we were going to get into the garbage cart business, and then the recycling cart business. And of course, this is all fake and it's all phony. At the same time, public safety is being compromised in the city. And isn't that what one of the chief responsibilities of your local city government is, to have good police service, good fire service, and of course,
And
instead,
paramedic service, the medical response service,
absolutely.
obviously.
Now, as they want to get into the garbage, they've gotten out of the community center business, so they say. They want to get out of the Maplewood Nature Center business. They're planning behind the scenes.
They're closing a fire station.
Yep, and so going down from 5 fire stations where there was emergency medical response from, down to 2, and they're saying, what? Believe us, we're credible. We speak with integrity. There's going to be no difference in response time. To drive all the way around St. Paul on the highway to get to your heart attack, it's not going to matter. To take care of a heart condition up by Cub Foods on Rice Street and 35-6, coming from down there by the 3M station, there's going to be no difference in care from a station that was only 5 blocks away. Believe us.
Next now, we are going to commence with our film footage from the recent Maplewood City Council workshop where they were discussing now today about whether or not to buy these recycling carts. And we showed some of this film footage last week, and we're returning to that film footage. Now, I will mention that with this next clip, you'll notice that the audio is really bad. That's not on our end. That's the way we find the film footage, because Maplewood, even though they have spent $500,000 per year every year since they opened up their new communications department, and that they have bought new equipment for the council chambers and new mics and new everything, they still can't figure out how to either find somebody in their IT department or somebody in their communications department to get the equipment to work properly. But let's suffer through the clip and see what it says.
I think Councilmember Juniman was next, and then Councilmember, okay, go ahead.
Quick question. So the 50 cents that we talked about as the cart fee, that is not included in the 440, correct? So it's actually 490, just to be clear.
Madam,
Okay, Councilmember Juniman.
Madam Mayor, I wasn't,
Oh, okay, hold on one second.
I didn't quite follow
Hold
that
on, just 1 second.
analogy.
Just wait 1 second.
So I had my microphone off.
Okay, chaos abounds. Councilmember Brian Smith is trying to make a point. City staff person who's busy trying to sell the concept of buying the carts, she can't understand what Brian Smith is saying, and so she's getting all nervous that he's actually saying something that is contrary to what she just said, so she can't figure out quick enough how to say something in response. And then the appointed mayor, Marley Abrams, she's busy there flopping her hands back and forth trying to figure out how she's going to manage this meeting when nobody can hear what anybody else had to say. So it's sort of like, Curly, Moe, and Joe up there.
It is. It's the, and what's odd is this kind of technical issue virtually never occurred when they were actually had a partnership with the other communities to run their cable and their internet service. That was with the SCC, Suburban Community Channels network out of White Bear Lake. It's when they went and they grabbed all that money and said, we can do better. Of course, in the Maplewood case, whenever they tell you that we're going to be chasing the rainbow and when we're in charge, everything's going to be better, don't believe them.
When I was mayor, the system that we had, once it was on, it was on. All the mics were on, so that if somebody said something, you could hear them. You wasn't dependent upon whether or not the system for that particular mic was on or off. And that's where some of their issues are, is that the mics don't necessarily turn off or turn on like they should, but the reason that they set it up so they wanted to have these microphones that they could turn on and turn off, I believe is because so often, and this happened when I was mayor, so often Kathleen Juniman, a council person who was on the council when I was mayor and continues on the council today, when it's not her time to speak, she's busy muttering under her breath, saying a lot of snide comments. And that typically would then come over the microphone while somebody else is talking. Certainly now when I was a mayor, I would ask her if she had something additional to say, and she quit mumbling under her breath.
Yep, and you call them.
And that is, and there's also incidences that we've seen where other people speak to each other and have sidebar discussions that they don't want to have come over the microphone when somebody else is speaking. So you see, part of this microphone issue is because of the type of system they wanted to have put in place so that they can have chit-chatting going on up at the council desk while the meeting is going on.
And you're very generous to call it just chit-chatting, kind of implying that they're just saying, how's your kids? Did your dog get fed? Are you going to go on your vacation? And actually, I think it's what's in reality is that what's going on is, and you take Kathleen Juniman as a perfect example, it's these snide remarks, this character assassination of the people in the audience if somebody they don't like, there's the cheap shots, there's the negative comments. They want to hide all that. And all this, a lot of this problems with Maplewood, and the reason Maplewood is in such a vortex hole of credibility and financial uncertainty and trying to tax people, residents, as much as they can, and the increasing crime and the poor business prospects in Maplewood is because Maplewood continues under Melinda Coleman as her primary virtue in her mind is to be a master of hiding things. We need to hide it. We need to hide it. We need to cover it. We can't disclose it to the public. We got to reframe it in terms which aren't accurate. We have to deceive the public. We have to patch out false information. Control
right.
and manipulation.
We have to control the situation so it doesn't go somewhere we don't want it to go. That if people have the knowledge of what is actually happening or the true facts, that then they will question. They will ask for accountability. And they don't want that because once those things happen, then they are no longer in control. Let's continue with our next clip.
490 and not 450. 440, I'm sorry.
Oh, I see. Yes, so the 2020 rate of 440 with city-owned carts would be what Tennis charges us. What the city turns around and charges the resident is to be determined because, you know, we would want to cover the cost of the carts, the cost of our recycling program. So that's something we would do that cost analysis on, you know, once all the cart details are in place. To answer your question, so it's 440 that Tennis would charge to us.
Correct. But then I'm seeing the estimated cart fee for replacement carts would be approximately 50 cents per household per month, correct?
So that's added on to it, so that's the
Could be
490.
added on.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, now this is where they're trying to do these calculations that you talked about. Right. They're proposing that it would only be 50 cents per household, extra charge on 50 cents for a cart, each bill. And yet, there's the recycling charge, which we already know is over 80 cents. And do we really think that it's going to be only 50 cents? Because that's only going to cover what that base cost is. They're going to say, well, we need to have more than that to put money aside to buy replacement carts, to buy the personnel we need, as you indicated, to care for the carts. There's all kinds of reasons and extra add-ons to add on to that bill. And so I think that the numbers you proposed earlier are probably more accurate than the numbers that the city council is trying to take a stab at.
And of course, I don't know about this flip-flop and changing the tunes. It was just a little bit before that, they were saying, well, we have all this extra money in our recycling fund fee, which we could, that would be a way to pay for the carts.
That's right, and that was back in May. So that's a good point. Back in May, they were saying we have all this money in the recycling fund where we could pay for the carts. Now here we are in September, August and September, and they're wondering where they're going to find the money. So you had thought that perhaps they've already used the money for something else. Well, I wonder.
Not only use the money, they probably had a deficit in that fund, which they're not reporting.
Now let's take a look at our next slide where Kathleen Juniman, who is the big advocate of the city owning all the carts, whether or not if it's trash or recycling carts, because remember, she likes the Stepford Wives community. She is looking at a way to help the city staff in the argument to support why the city must have the carts in their possession. Let's take a look.
6, could you explain funded by recycling reserve fund? I don't care who answers it.
Ms. Finwell?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Juniman, were you saying, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Under the recycling carts section, you have the number of carts, the size and all, and then the second from the bottom point says funded by recycling reserve fund.
Okay, thank you. So when we first took a look at purchasing carts, our finance director indicated that it does appear that we could purchase those carts with our existing recycling reserve funds.
Thank you. So we're not doing an additional bond like we did for the trash carts, correct?
Correct, if that's the way you choose to purchase them.
Okay, so I'm puzzled by this whole exchange here. Because first of all, Kathleen Juniman asked a very straightforward question, and yet Sean Finwell, who is the chief city administrative staff person in charge of this whole program, needed her to repeat the question, which seemed very straightforward.
Odd.
And then it's, okay, yes, we do have the money in that account to purchase the carts if that's the way you choose to buy them. Why would they choose to buy them in any other way if they had the cash on hand if they're buying carts? Wouldn't buying it any other way have a interest associated with it and actually end up costing more?
And I think, again, you're on something big. This tentativeness, these careful maneuvering of language, again, you get the sense that there is a fund there, and if you listen to her, she kind of implies that the money is there, but if you just step back for a moment, you're thinking, no, there's no money there. And Kathleen Juniman might know about that, but she wants the city professional administrator to play along with her hoax. And we all know that Kathleen Juniman changes her tune from one moment to the next. And then once they make the decision, they'll just flip-flop.
Well, and here's what came to my mind, is that yes, the money is there, but in the back room, we've been speaking about how we could use that money for something else that doesn't include carts. Because we talked about, remember, those interdepartmental loans? We also know that the Maplewood Council, in order to promote these developments at Frost and English, that if they want Sherman and Associates to move forward with that phase 3, as we've covered on these news programs, the city of Maplewood has to come up with $600,000 from some other city source. It can't be tax increment financing. It can't be bonds. It actually has to be cash from some other source, because then they will borrow that, lend that to Sherman and Associates for that phase 3. And there has been a lot of discussion about where will they find that $600,000 in cash. So what I see when I see this clip and I hear between the lines is that Sean Finwall is saying, well, sure, the money's there to buy the carts if that's how you choose to buy them. Wink, wink, say no more. Don't forget, we're already going to use that money in an intergovernmental loan to do something else. So if you want to get the carts, we're going to have to use those equipment bonds again to buy the carts.
And I think you're most likely right in that. From what I know, that their real council meeting, they have a puppet show that they put on when they turn the cameras on, but they have their real meeting in part in the back room where they eat dinner beforehand, where they talk about what are the priorities and how they're going to be doing things. And when they come out in front of the cameras, we're all just playing a big skit. It's increasingly, incredibly difficult to understand if you can have any faith in their words and in their credibility with how they are behaving. And there's just 3 of them are appointed out of 5. They're all in the same boat. There's no contention. There's no diversity of thought, diversity of ideas. There's nobody who challenges everything. Everybody seems like they're going to be prosecuted if they say anything out of turn. They got a real can of worms up at Maplewood. I mean, they don't have the can of worms. The public in Maplewood and the taxpayers they've created a real pile of dog doo up there.
Yeah. Well, let's continue with our next clip.
Ms. Paulsop, do you want to comment on that about the reserve fund?
Mayor and council, the recycling fund does have some surplus, so that is primarily what she's referring to as the reserve fund. It's a surplus that's been built up over several years, and it would be available to use for carts if the council decided that was the direction they wanted to go.
Again, it left it very wide open if that's the direction the council wants to go. The direction being either A, the direction that the council wants to buy carts, or 2, the direction that the council wants to use that money to buy the carts for cash when they know they have the option that they could buy the carts using equipment bonds just like they did with the garbage carts. Now let's take a look at our next clip as they talk about funding options.
So follow-up question from Ms. Paulsett, and thank you. Follow-up question from Ms. Paulsett, though. Don't we have other funds that are underfunded, and could we use that surplus to replace funds into our other reserve funds that are underfunded today?
Madam Mayor and Council, I wish that was the case, but the recycling fund, because there is a state grant that flows into it, is very restricted.
Okay.
Okay, that's helpful. Councilmember Knutson.
Now that too is wishy-washy to me because there are 2 different ways that you can move funds around in municipal financing. One, there can be a resolution of the council that just simply says we want to move funds from our Parks and Rec Fund over to take care of an issue at the Maplewood Community Center. I mean, that's been done in the past. That money wasn't paid back by the Maplewood Community Center. It was just money that was moved according to resolution, and that can be done. What she's saying is that, from the way I take it, is that that process cannot be used to take those funds from the recycling reserve and just move it over to another fund to take care of a deficit in some other fund. However, it doesn't address the issue of these interdepartmental and inter-fund loans, because we know that they can do those because it's a paper trail that implies that there is the obligation to pay that money back, because they did it with the sanitary utility fund and they've done it with other funds, And why is it that they wouldn't do it with this fund as well, as long as they have the established paper trail?
And what I'm hearing also, what Councilmember Brian Smith is, I think he's getting at, but he's speaking in coded languages, is if we get funds, a grant from Ramsey County, can we flip that $330,000, which is meant to go to the purchase of recycling carts, can we flip that over to some other fund and then take and finance the whole purchase of recycling carts on a bond or on a monthly fee onto the recycling carts? And that's the one thing she was very clear on, is if you're taking money from Ramsey County for that specific purpose, it is very restricted.
Right, exactly.
You can just see the mindset of the schemes going on with the council up there at the city of Maplewood.
And that's a good distinction between the fact that some of that money is the grant money, and how can we use, can we use that grant money to flip it to use it for something else, and then we'll just go borrow against it. But you see, that's part of how Maplewood got into the financial pickles that they were in, because when they were doing their road street improvement projects and bonding for those projects, they would actually include in their bonds that they were taking out, they were including enough money that would cover all of the special assessments, including even those special assessments where people paid cash. So then they would take the cash that they collected from people paying their special assessments, they would take that cash and not apply it to that road improvement project that it applied to, but they would take that cash and actually use it somewhere else and borrow for the whole entire project when they had been collecting cash for a part of it.
Right.
So you see, it's the same financial mindset of how can we take the cash coming in and then use it for a different purpose, but then borrow for all of it. That is just bad planning.
And of course, the difference, because she really was chomping at the bit to put a sword in his argument, the finance director of Maplewood. And I think probably why she was doing that is because this money wasn't coming from the residents, the owners, the public of the city. This was coming from the government. And the government could very easily Ramsey County could hold Maplewood accountable. And they would demand and restrict it. Now, they know where their money is being used. The public, the individual residents of Maplewood, have no idea how they're flip-flopping their money around, shifting their money around, their property tax money and their other money they collect from residents up there at City Hall. The only thing we know is we want to hide what we're doing. We want to have curtains in front of everything, while at the same time we want to tell you that we are the model of transparency. That's why people have a sense there's so much phoniness, and they don't believe it's not only phoniness with the commercial media, but there's phoniness and they basically think false information coming right out of whether it's the federal government or their own city hall in their backyard.
And the city hall is worried about fake news. Well, Mr. Berglund, I want to thank you for helping with this week's news program.
Thanks for having me.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again next week when we conclude this report on the purchase of trash carts in Maplewood. Bye-bye.